Good afternoon, everybody. The Center for Data Innovation is pleased to have a wonderful panel here to speak about how can the EU Digital Market Act unlock the power of data. So we have today 5 speakers. First, Thomas Kemmler, which is the head of the data unit at the DG Comp. Then we have Philippe Malache, which is director of EU policy at Facebook. We have Karina Stan, director of EU policy at Developer Alliance. We have Dr. Andreas Schwems, MEP, which is the rapporteur of the DMA. And we have Professor Marshall Valanen, who writes obviously on platform, and is also an author of the report on the DMA, GCA report here. And myself, my name is Christophe Caratier. I am a senior policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, and I am also a doctor in law and economics on big data and competition law. So you have a panel of experts that are working on digital issues and in particular on data issues here. So the discussion will be divided in 3 parts. First one will be about the content of the DMA, basically. The second one will be about whether there can be an alternative about the DMA, if any, and the third part will be about the DMA in a global context, I would say. So thank you again for your acceptance to this conference. And I will start with a question to Thomas Kemmler. So the first question is, what are the data-related concerns here? And which data requirements should gatekeeper have to comply with?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be able to speak about the data-related issues in the DMA. But first, let me just take one step back and explain a bit the rationale of the DMA, because it's important, I think, to understand why the data-related provisions feature in Articles 5 and 6 of the DMA. So the DMA is a regulatory tool. It's not competition law 2.0. So it's a complement to competition law. It's not replacing current competition law. That's why the concepts that are used in the DMA cannot be directly transposed from what we have seen, cases we have seen, issues that have been raised under competition law. I think that's very important to keep in mind when we discuss the DMA obligations. So the goals of the DMA therefore go beyond what are the goals of current competition law, and also sometimes of what can be achieved reasonably with the tools of competition law. And the goals, as you all know, are twofold. There's the contestability goal, and there it already becomes very clear that this goes beyond the goals of competition law, because as it stands currently, and everybody knows that, competition law can only deal with abuses of market power or dominant position, whilst the DMA seeks to go further and look into structural issues. And that's very important when we discuss data, structural issues that have arisen because of data accumulation, for instance. So the DMA wants to go further than competition law in this respect. And also the second goal is not fully, doesn't fully square with competition law goals. It's the fairness goal, and this is mainly about fairness in business relationships, where one of the party is much stronger than the other party, and there's a dependency relationship, which doesn't have to be a dominant company as in current competition law, but where a company basically has the business users have a dependency relationship on a big gatekeeper platform, and therefore there's a risk that business relationships are tilted towards the gatekeeper, and that's the fairness objective. So with these two objectives in mind, let us dwell into the data-related provisions. And as I said, the DMA is not competition law, and it's also not competition law 0.0, so it doesn't want to replace competition law. But obviously, there's some inspiration, or at least some learnings that we can draw from the 15, 20 years of experience with data-related issues in competition law cases that we have. And I would think that there are 3 issues that the DMA seeks to address, and they fit nicely into the contestability and fairness goals that I just mentioned. So first, there's the issue of data accumulation. We know that big gatekeeper platforms have, through various means, the power to accumulate massive of data lakes, as they're sometimes called. And these data lakes might create barriers to entry. They might make it more difficult for other companies to compete with these big gatekeeper platforms, and that therefore can be a concern in terms of contestability and making markets more contestable. A second big topic is so-called disintermediation. It's that the big gatekeeper platforms are intermediaries very often between consumers and business users, and therefore, as the middlemen, gather a lot of data about business users and about their customers. But very often they don't give back this data to the business users. So the business users are basically disintermediated from their customers. They don't know actually what happens with what they are selling, for instance, on a platform, the products they are selling on a platform, how many people look at them, how many people like them, how many people don't like them, and what happens. These data all go to the gatekeeper platforms, and the business users basically lose touch, if you want, with their consumers. So that's the disintermediation concern. And the third concern is more a concern on the consumer side, which the DMA also seeks to address, and where it seeks to complement GDPR mainly on the data side, and that you find in the portability provisions, and that's lock-in. So that consumers are basically locked into the big platforms, have a hard time when they move off, want to move off, because the data are basically centralized in the hands of the gatekeeper platforms, and it's not easy for consumers to switch to other platforms because of the data lock-in. So if one takes now the separate provisions and tries to see where they fit in this scheme, I would first start with Article 5A, which is, for those who are not that familiar with the DMA, is the rule that says that the gatekeeper platform cannot combine from different sources personal data. One example that many people have in mind, and which has also been litigated in one member state, namely Germany, is Facebook combining the WhatsApp and the Instagram data with data from Facebook. But that's just one example. This data combination also happens with other platforms. So what the DMA provides for is that this can only happen with opt-in, consent and opt-in, which is a complement, as we would see it, to what is already provided for in the GDPR. Makes it a bit stronger, this obligation in terms of gatekeepers, and should therefore help to prevent the data lakes and lower the barriers to entry. So that's one of the reasons why this provision features in the DMA. Then there's Article 6A, which is about cross-use of data in competition with business users. So if a platform has a so-called dual role, i.e. is on the one hand active as a provider of services to business users, but on the other hand competes with the very same business users as a platform, what the platform shouldn't be doing is to use the data it acquires from the business users in order to compete with them head-to-head. So that's more in the category of fairness, I would think, but it has obviously to do with data accumulation and how to prevent that big platforms accumulate data from the business users. Then there's also Article 6J, which is about search engine data. This is clearly about the contestability issue. So how do you make the search engine market, which is dominated, as we all know, by one company, how do you make that more contestable? There we know from our case experience, especially in the Google search case, that it is not easy to compete with the search engine, especially on the so-called long tail data, the data queries that don't happen very often, which are only searched for once in a while. These data, you need to have them in order to provide good search, but they're difficult to get hold of. And with this provision, which seeks to ensure contestability in search engine markets, competitors of the gatekeeper search engine would have access to this kind of data and can thereby improve their own search service and make it better, and therefore make the market more contestable. So these are the three examples where data accumulation plays a role and where data accumulation is addressed in the DMA. Disintermediation is addressed mainly by 6i, which is a provision that gives business users access to the data that they have generated or that their own customers have generated on platforms. So this is basically what I explained before. The business users should, not only the gatekeeper should have access to this data, but also the business users should basically have access to, if I can say so, their own customer data. And therefore disintermediation should be limited. So that's 6 little I. And then last but not least, a provision which is quite important, I think, is the portability provision in 6H. And this focuses not only on consumers, but also on business users. It goes a bit beyond, therefore, the GDPR. It focuses not only on data which are generated by the consumers, but also those of the business users, and therefore complements, I think I would say nicely, Article 20 of the GDPR, which, as you know, only focuses on personal data of consumers, but not of business users. So it goes a bit beyond, and it makes clear that there needs to be also in complementarity to the GDPR, that there needs to be real-time access and not just a one-off, which has been criticized very often as regards Article 20 of the GDPR, that it's actually a data dump. Many people have said if you ask for it, you get 300 pages of PDFs, which you then cannot use any further. This provision should allow direct real-time data portability, a bit like what has been done in financial services under the Payment Services Directive 2. So with that, I'll already conclude the overview. I don't want to keep you too long. Just to say that obviously from what I just said, you can see that data-related provisions are central to the DMA. And I think rightly so, because many of the obstacles we see that have been arising in relation to markets where gatekeepers are present relate to the use of data and the presence of data. I think generally these provisions are very much balanced. It's not going too far. It's a balanced approach towards ensuring more contestability and more fairness without negating that their data holding and data accumulation has also or contributes also to innovation and has also important goals there. So I think generally the obligations are balanced. They're not too far-reaching, I would say, although some of them are far-reaching. But I think the balance is struck correctly. But obviously this is up for discussion now, and the co-legislators will have a lot to say on whether this balance is struck correctly or not in the forthcoming process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, for all this, for your presentation, very interesting, and for this introduction about the data-related aspect of the DMA. For the participant, you have the ability to ask questions via Slido, but because we'll have a Q&A at the end of this conference, a 15-minute Q&A. Before turning to the other question to Marshall, I'm just wondering if one of you would like to have a word. I'm sure you have some things to say about this introduction. Philippe, do you have any remarks to do?
So you want me to jump in, or did you want to direct that to Malak?
No, I'm doing just a little round about whether you have a short comment about this.
No, I think Thomas just gave a very factual walkthrough of what's in the DMA there, so nothing to add at this point. Okay.
So we'll turn to the question to you, Professor Marshall. You wrote this amazing book about platform regulation. I highly recommend this book. But we will speak about the DMA right now. And my question is, how do data requirements achieve the DMA goal of ensuring a contestable and fair digital market? And how should policymakers ensure that this requirement don't undermine innovation in digital markets?
So first of all, thanks for the book plug. Actually, I'll have to buy you a beer after that sometime when we get a chance and get all past COVID. So I actually have a variety of comments. I hope this will be helpful for everyone. But there are several where let me complement several of the areas of the DMA, and then I want to take issue with several that I think things could be improved. So several of the goals, I think, are noble. So in fairness and increasing competition, or certainly increasing contestability. And I surely agree with this idea that data shouldn't be disintermediated from the businesses themselves. I'll give you an interesting example of what you just provided. Amazon sells my book, but I have no idea who bought it, and I can't tell. So I've effectively been disintermediated from my own readers. So Amazon's terrible, and I think those elements of DMA are a huge plus. There are, however, several elements where I think DMA could use some improvement. So candidly, I think the goals of contestability and fairness are noble, but I actually think one of the most essential goals that is missing, and I have not heard articulated, is wealth creation. In fact, I think a large proportion of the questions, and where I think it should actually be substantially improved, is theories of value as opposed to theories of harm. And especially around platforms, and a huge amount of the value is from aggregating data or creating network effects. So this might be the case where your search makes my search better, or my movie watching behavior makes someone else's movie watching behavior better. A simple way to summarize platforms is often they are the large-scale aggregation of small-scale network effects, which is an immense way to create value. And the more you partition this data, the more you may destroy some of that value. To give you a really simple illustration, so I disagree with one of these ideas where you can't merge data sets. To give you a really simple illustration, if you were to push GDPR to an extreme where each person were to own their contact data, you couldn't do contact tracing. If you have everyone opt in, the amount of friction that would be taking place, and the literal consequence of that is more people would die. So that's an instance in which we haven't been able to create the potential social wealth because we've actually had fragmented data sets. So I actually think one of the primary goals of good regulation is how do we create wealth, from which we then ask the secondary question, how do we divide it? How do we do that fairly? How do we give that back to the users or the people that are generating that data as a way to actually make that work? To give you another illustration of the same thing. So I think data portability is an interesting solution to the issue of trying to help people create markets and create data, but I actually want to identify several problems with it and see if we can identify a better solution. So for data portability, so one problem is it often removes context. There was a great analysis that was done by the folks at the Programmable Web that handle APIs. They tried to use the provisions of GDPR and download data. And what they found is you lose context for that data. So if you pull your post from Facebook, the complementary posts that people have made about yours or the things that you've responded to are their data. And Facebook doesn't give it to you. So you don't get that and you lose the context. Another, which part of the new regulation less, is the decay rate. So you'd like to be able to constant updates. The real time is a nice improvement on that, but there's a decay if there's a one-time element of it. A third problem is by creating multiple sources, you increase the liability and the probability of data breach. So you actually increase the risk of different parties having access to that data. And other thing that happens is by removing it from context, it's not actionable. You can't use it to make a post. You can't use it to make a purchase, in that others can't share a coupon with you in a different location. So while I applaud some of the efforts around Gaia X or others, the lack of actionability when you remove data set from its location actually makes it lower in value. What we'd like to, or a third and a fourth problem, and this is what I think is largely unanticipated. And I totally support this idea of reducing lock-in. But if you're a business and you pull all of your data from a site like Amazon, there's the danger of having a new problem, a moral hazard problem. Suppose a merchant then only posts exclusively their 5-star reviews and eliminates their 1- and 2-star reviews. Now we have data bias, and you've actually increased the risk of purchasing to consumers because of the moral hazard of selective reporting of that data. All right, so these are all problems associated with data portability. We would like to propose a new right. So I've actually been doing some work with Jeffrey Parker and Petropoulos. We'd like to propose an in situ right. That is, you have the ability to use data where it is resident. In this case, I think PSD2 is a far superior model. You gain the ability to give third parties permission to access your data. What's this do? It creates competition on top of that data. It eliminates the problem of obsolescence because it's all the live data. It's also totally actionable. So you can use it to make a purchase. You can use it to make a post. You can use it to select it. You've kept all of the context in this. And it gets even better. Suppose you now want to deny someone the right to have access to your data because they've behaved badly. If you turn it off, you don't have to worry about them losing access because they never got it in the first place. The concept is you move the algorithm to the data rather than the data to the algorithm. So we would actually like to use API technology and some legal rights to propose a new right that we would call an in situ right, as distinct from this data portability right. And to be quite candid, we think this is far more powerful and gives you a lot more flexibility than what has been proposed in the DMA. To give you one or two more small data points, I think PSD2, again, is a better piece of legislation. There is some factual data, some empirical research out of GDPR that shows that after GDPR came into place, venture capital investment in Europe went down. The entrenchment of Google and Facebook and ad market went up, not down, because it's harder for smaller firms to actually gain access to the data. And third, the number of apps removed from the store went down. It actually destroyed a quarter of consumer surplus. There's some new empirical evidence on that. So while the goals are noble, I think there's some better practices to do this. So I would argue, again, to summarize, I think the first question we need to ask is how to create that value. And the second question is then how do we give it back to consumers and create fairness in the allocation of that value? So that's why I would summarize better ways of doing data management.
Thomas, would like to reply to this PSD2 initiative, kind of PSD2 in the DMA.
Yeah, I think you've probably a too literal reading of the word portability that you're making of this. I think it's not excluded that this will go in the direction of PSD2, namely that you get real-time, or a third party gets real-time access to the data of the consumers. I don't think that even the current wording of the portability obligation doesn't exclude it. It's certainly the one that deals with the disintermediation already speaks about the third party authorized by the business users who get access to the data. So I think, yes, I would tend to agree with you that PSD2 is probably the superior model to Article 20 GDPR. And if you would have to choose between the two, I would rather err on the side of PSD2 than Article 20. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I would,
because of the if I may, because of the implicit you empower the consumer to directly give the data to third parties, which also from a competition point of view seems to be superior to having the consumer first port its data, then move them to the third party and take all the hustle itself, if I can say so. Whilst here the third party would basically step in and intermediate between consumers and the data owner or the data holder. Yeah.
So I think the last point is really the most important one. What you're doing is you're giving the user power to grant permission to different parties in here, which allows them to then capture the benefits in exchange for granting that permission. I also completely agree that I think the real-time access is really important. That's a big improvement. I haven't heard corrections to the moral hazard problem, the removal of context, or the actionability from data portability. So I think those things are another element. But again, I really do think that by giving this added right to users, firms are going to have to reward them for that extra permission and then can use it in location. And that I think will help solve some of the problems of the division of that value. But I think, again, really what we want to do is try to create value in the first place.
Maybe Swap, thank you for being there. Do you have any remarks? You are the rapporteur of the DMA. Do you think the DMA can evolve in a kind of PSD2 regulation?
Well, first of all, I think that Thomas Gramler has perfectly taken the approach of very precisely and silently addressing step by step all the elements of the DMA. And this has always been the approach of the European Commission. And I think it's very important to, if you step into uncharted waters, to be always safe about what you think and what you say. But it has shown that after 10 years, we have now to move to action. And I think that Mr. van Alsten has rightly pointed out that we are all having huge advantages of the techniques that are used. But there is also a very strong but. But the problem is that these advantages have been focused on a few, and not because these few have been better than the others, but because they have been bigger than the others. And that cannot be an argument for an open market economy. We should therefore, to take up what Mr. van Alsten has said, try to convince the public that sharing data is an advantage to get better performances of services and of digital tools. But we need to reassure, first of all, that consumers are aware when they give away data. And this cannot only be done with data general data protection regulation. This is far too bureaucratic, so I'm welcoming a lot that he's proposing to do that rather on a PSD2 approach. But at the same time of this, so in investing into people sharing their data, we also have to make sure that we don't cement in some way, the market position of the big ones. And I have to tell you that in my personal experience, the transparency of the big ones, how they deal with data, has been as bad as it could have been. And therefore, public policymakers are fed up with these companies and will hit hard. And we have plenty of ideas how to get larger, far away from what Mr. Kramler is proposing. We have very good ideas to make the PSD2 approach working, but against these companies, because we want to be the user, the consumer in the center, and the wealth creation that Mr. van Alstyne has been referring to. And I think it's great if we can speak about it. And I would like to give you an example, which is always the best example to prove to you that we are not against. I think Amazon has by far been the most successful the most successful player in developing the European single market. Where politicians have failed, Amazon has delivered. This is quite a bad testimonial to the single market policy makers, and we have to take note of that. And I could also say as positive comments on the other companies that are in focus now. But we have also to see that this game cannot be a one-way street. We have to make sure that in the end, the bigger don't get bigger and bigger without getting better, but that we really achieve what Mr. van Alstyne has said, that we improve the performance based on data. And that's what we should be doing. And to get there, and this is very important because we are speaking rather still about the competition policy reflection. It's far beyond, it's going far beyond competition policy, but we are still speaking about the reflection of competition policy and not about consumer protection. And for that reason, if we can open up markets by improving competition, we should maybe even have a flexibility on 5 and 6 of the DMA. So my example is all the time. Let's imagine that Facebook is promising to the European Commission, investing $2 billion into 10 years into a marketplace within Facebook. Let's be honest, for sure, that would also be a closed system then, because they wanted to self-privilege this platform. But by doing so, they could become a real competitor to Google and to Amazon. So in that sense, maybe we should consider to give up for 2 years a special permission for them to self-privilege their own platform, but they promise us on beforehand that they will invest a lot of money in this. Like that, we would improve competition, and we would serve the aim that Mr. van Alstyne has mentioned, because the wealth will be improved. And on that, I think we need a certain flexibility with fresh ideas. And I can only tell you that I very, very clearly want to invite these companies to come up with ideas, because we won't ask them if they continue as in the past to come up with wrong or hidden figures that don't use that don't help us at all. We will go on the line that we think can be useful. Our reflection is, and I will finalize with this, at the moment we are stuck. Unfortunately, the innovation is not going anymore as it could go. We take note and respect of what these companies have been achieving, but we believe that by banning killer acquisitions, by opening data, we can improve again wealth in Europe, but even beyond Europe, and that's what we want to aim. And if they want to work with us, we are open, but if they don't want, we do it with the European Commission and with books like Marshall von Einstein's ones, because we believe that they can be very helpful.
Thank you, MEP Schwab. I will, from regulation to industry initiative, you mentioned the term initiative. I will ask to Mr. Philippe Malache a question about that. According to you, Mr. Malache, can gatekeepers, whatever it means, and whatever which frame is named gatekeeper here, can gatekeeper offer solutions that address data-related concerns, which is the need for regulation here?
Yeah, thank you, Christoph, and thank you to the CDI for the invite as well. And Mr. Schwab can visit Facebook Marketplace today. It is there competing with Amazon and eBay and the others. So it's good to know that we're on the right track with those. We're willing to work with you there. So just one of the things I'd like to start off with here is on the question around data sharing. This is already a big part of Facebook's culture. partner with a huge number of organizations on sharing data and insights of data from Facebook. Just to reference some of the data-related concerns, I think Marshall referenced some of them, so I won't dwell on how to sort of conceptualize these. But clearly, some of the ideas around accumulation we don't think is as straight a line as is often sort of laid out there in terms of problem to solution. We are willing to explore absolutely more ways to advance data sharing. We are doing so already in many areas. This is both technically and commercially an incredibly complex area as well. And I think this requires us all to work together to try and see how we can address some of those issues around ensuring more data is shared. So moving through to some more kind of specific discussions about kind of how and why we think about data sharing in certain ways. So assuming that Facebook would be a gatekeeper at the end of this process, we're an organization that already is involved in a lot of initiatives around sharing data. Data transfer project, for example, is one which we've been working with for a number of years now to facilitate the transfer of personal data and people to be able to move their content between different platforms. We work with a number of data for good initiatives, for example, to provide social value from data, and also programs like CrowdTangle as well, which allow people to get insights into what's happening on Facebook platforms as well, across different areas. We're also a company that's at the forefront of the technical initiatives around data sharing. We think there's a huge amount of value in these initiatives because it's clear from a number of different discussions that obviously the data economy is where we are, and the advantages that come from that from a number of different stakeholders is hugely important. Data, of course, in many ways is a real powerful conduit for social and important issues of our time. We work heavily on data issues around COVID-19, for example, and also around issues around climate change. We think this is a very important part of what data can do, enabling sharing with different types of stakeholders. Just to give you an example of a couple of partnerships we have right now, we've partnered with researchers at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Germany, the Research Center for Environmental Health, to develop a model for weekly forecasting of local COVID-19 cases. We've worked with researchers at the École Polytechnique in France and the Athens University School of Economics and Business to study population movement and the spread of COVID-19. So really the importance of collaboration, and I think maybe as Marshall referenced to the ability to be able to extract value from data is a hugely important part of what we are working with. We think tech companies, potentially those who will end up being gatekeepers at the end of this process of DMA, can play an even greater role when it comes to accessing data across Europe. There is particularly the small businesses which have a huge amount of value from the data online. I think a number of people have pointed to provisions in the DMA which aim to drive value for businesses and small businesses and be able to do that. Just an important thing, I mean, we're a company that's learned the hard way, that this all needs to be done in a way in which we really value the privacy of the end users and also the security of the data. I think that's a really important discussion around how you move data or leave data in situ, or as has been mentioned before. But in many areas, I think data alone itself is not sufficient in terms of what we're talking about here. So, for example, for companies, we already provide important data insights as well as data itself, especially for small and medium-sized businesses to improve their commercial presence, manage and understand the performance of their digital strategies as well to make them more competitive and effective within the single market. I think Dr. Schwab referenced the fact that many of these platforms are a very powerful conduit to the single market. And this is one of the things which we think is really important when thinking about how we share data and the insights offered from data. So Facebook Insight tools also mean that businesses can understand their customer base and also in a privacy protective manner also find new customers also to grow. We think this is hugely important as well. We also complement this with a number of free business tools on top, which allow businesses to be able to communicate with their users and also they'll be able to have certain business management tools which enable them to action the data and also bring value to their consumers. So by sharing data, we think this is a real powerful sort of empowerment of the single market. And we think it's really important. It's something that the DMA can actually complement as well here. So to that call to work together, that's something we're really keen and open to do here in terms of coming to the right solution in the Digital Markets Act. Another example, Facebook platform, where developers can develop things. We have a game developer, Nordeus, who launched a game called Golden Boot. They used Facebook tools and data-driven learning at their soft launch stage, which allowed them to actually include more social gaming options within their launch. This led to very quickly the accumulation of 1 million new players through friend invites and challenge invites as well. So taking those learnings from the data and being able to then utilize that in being a better business offering and a better commercial offering. I'll sum it up with 2 thoughts then at the end of this process. We'll continue to take a very proactive role in this space. We think it's hugely important. We'll continue to invest in a number of different initiatives around data sharing and data in this space. We'll continue to partner with many organizations and hopefully partner with the European institutions now in coming to a positive DMA at the end of this, and continue to provide the benefits. Just on the DMA specifically, we do think DMA can assist in facilitating a greater element of data sharing, but we need provisions which are very actionable and very clear. And I think that's the work we can do now as we move through the process with the co-legislatures to ensure clarity and legal certainty on these things, which I'm sure will get done at the end. And this kind of lends itself also to more industry level discussion as well. I think we pointed to the beginning, this is not only a legal question, there's enormous technical questions here as well. And so if you want a DMA which is workable quickly, I think we as an industry need to begin discussions in a meaningful way about how we facilitate these types of things. So thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you very much, Philippe. One of the problem when we speak about data interoperability is when you face, for example, in the consumer communication services, you have encryption here, and it is complicated to have interoperability when you have this kind of security level. So my question is just quickly to Mr. Kremler here to react. Do you think the Commission will be open, whatever is DG Comp or another unit as a Commission, will be open to discussion which at industry level to see whether we can have a technical relation or standard here?
I think whenever we speak about data access, data portability, one of the underlying issues is always standardization. How do you ensure that the data can flow in a standardized way so they're usable on the other end of the recipient? So without, and the example of PSD2 is actually a very good one. There was a lot of standardization efforts that went into it by the European Banking Authority. So in the implementation of the DMA, whenever we come to it, I think it would be crucial that standards are established in order to allow for seamless data exchange, especially when we talk about real-time data access or data exchange without APIs and standards. This will not work. So to make this work practically, I think it will be key that standards are developed by industry, but also with the help of the regulator. It needs to be a carrot and stick approach, I think. No, only the carrot alone will not work. Sometimes you might have also to use the stick in order to bring the industry in the right direction. But without standards, I think it will not properly work.
Thank you, Thomas. Speaking about standard, I will turn to Karina. Karina, you are here. Thank you very much for your acceptance to this conference. And you represent, in a way, a small and medium-sized enterprise, I would say, compared to big tech companies. I'm just wondering, to what extent are small and medium-sized enterprise the concern with data requirement? I spoke with a lot of stakeholders, and they said, oh yes, but we want to scale up and we have the threshold effect. And then the second question is, how can the DMA encourage investment in collecting and processing data here? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me and also for these great questions. Yeah, indeed, we are looking at the DMA through the lens of software developers, and we are interested to see the potential benefits of such regulation, but also we can foresee some unintended consequences. And I was happy to hear right from the beginning Mr. Kramner talking about the goals of the regulation, because I think we are now in a critical moment. The co-legislators are now in a critical moment when they need to specify these goals, and they need to specify the vision of what are the desired outcomes of this regulation. And we are quite interested in that, because for us it's very important to see who will benefit from this regulation, and of course if software developers will be amongst them. So we can see, of course, the data related obligations that are following, the ideas of data, more data access, more data portability, more interoperability. We are welcoming this. We see, as I said, benefits, new opportunities for developers. But I think it's important in specifying these objectives, not to start from false premises. For example, on data like AI is quite hype now these days. It's seen like the magic solution, and we see that data is only one of the ingredients that the startup or small business needs. It's definitely not the magic ingredients for success. It's just one of them. And what is important is to think that real competition and innovation is represented usually by disruptive solution, niche specializations, solutions that radically improve existing solutions. So these are very important when we want to see how these obligations will be implemented in practice. Also, it is essential not to pursue these objectives, for example, fair data access or interoperability, as an objective in itself, just for the sake of, having a regulation with these objectives. So putting them in practice and obtaining, real concrete results, that is important. The coherence of when applying these objectives is quite essential. So the policy objectives should be aligned. We can observe a certain dichotomy, for example, within the DMA, like in Article 5A is imposing some kind of data walls. Yeah, so while the provisions in Article 6 require data sharing and interoperability, so more openness. Similarly, coherence should be also with the DSA, which is, in the same legislative package, which is also requiring more control. So I think here the co-legislator should find the right balance, of course. On interoperability, well, this is, as I said, we are interconnectivity, interoperability. This is, it's a great premise to have, more openness, to open up markets and new opportunities. But we have to make sure about the challenges, and the previous speakers mentioned, standardization is needed. So here industry should be deeply involved. There are several possible constraints we can foresee. So technical nature, security, how to develop the right standards, but others from, of legal nature, notably related to data protection, privacy, intellectual property. So the benefits of such remedies for developers could be easily shadowed by such complications. I mean, I'm just thinking, for example, the legal responsibility for ensuring privacy and security in the case of various mixed data sets. So that's a hard problem. we should find solutions to that in the implementation. So we are happy to see that most of these obligations are situated in Article 6, so on obligations that should be further specified, because yes, indeed, it's a case-by-case application. We should consider not only the specifics of each platform, but also the use cases, for example, where interoperability would be viable. It is important for us also to avoid unintended consequences, and I hope the co-legislators will pay attention to this. We are hearing a lot about the so-called essential facility approach. Well, here we have to see if there is not it could be a risk of an increased level of standardized services and products, a lack of differentiation in certain markets. And we think that this outcome would not be an incentive for more innovation, would not offer added value to consumers. So it is for the co-legislators to put in balance all the trade-offs and to decide what is the desired outcome. So interoperability should not be an objective in itself. Also, I think it's for us, again, I have to repeat, the regulation, for us, the main question is, will the regulation provide the right incentives and the right benefits to those that are created value on top of the platforms within these digital ecosystems, like software developers, for those that are, innovative entrepreneurs that are, building complementary products, new products, or will this regulation mostly benefit to those that are, let's say, providing more substitutes, poor substitutes, copying, that they are in the business of copying only, existing products. So I think it is for the co-legislators to find the right balance and to, well, of course, from our perspective, to promote those solutions that are, benefiting the first category of businesses. Not to forget, I think it's an essential, speaking of goals and how to implement them, it is very important to have in mind that this should be a future-proof regulation. So a lot of obligations are based on specific cases, as we all know, but I think the regulation should be future-proof. So one needs to think how these obligations would work on different business models in different areas. I'm just thinking, for example, consider automotive software. Yeah, so we have in the scope, we have operating systems. So I think it could be a hypothetical exercise for co-legislators to think how this would work in, on other use cases than those that are based on. So that's food for thoughts. Very quick on investments in collecting and processing data. Well, the industry understood the need to minimize data collection and the user's interest in preserving their privacy. We had many conversations with developers on these topics, and we will continue to promote the best practices for data collection and processing. There are developments in this area these days. There are new solutions that are proposed. I think the future is to do more with less data. We are firmly convinced that developing personalized digital products and services is possible with full respect of privacy, and consumers should not be deprived of their added value, and it should be always their choice. Investments, well, they are always voluntary, driven by market demand, but also could be less voluntary by regulatory burdens, of course, the stick and carrot that Mr. Gramler talked about. So We are more for the carrot. We think that instead of rigid rules, regulations should provide incentives for such investments. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, very much for your presentation, and it's very, very interesting. I know MEP Swap and Professor Van Allen want to reply to your comment, but Mr. MEP Swap has to leave on time. Sorry, and so I will go to the next question for you, MEP Swap. It's about the DMA in its international context here. And the question is, regulating large online platforms is on the table in many countries, like in the UK, in the US, Australia, and China, to name a few. How should Europe work with other nations to establish a coherent global digital economy landscape? Karina, you mentioned the DSA, but there is also the DGA. And DGA is the Data Governance Act for the audience here. So please, the floor is yours, MEP Swap. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christoph. I mean, the questions are a bit interlinked, but obviously the key driver for this proposal of the European Commission is that starting with the market pressure within the US in the, let's say, 2010 years, it's nowadays a global question. And I think to connect with what Ms. Stan has said, developers all over the world are struggling to find the way through for their companies. And the same for the questions that have been analyzed before. The wealth creation via digital means is growing and growing and growing. So it's obvious a worldwide question, and the interest from countries like Japan, Australia, but also Indonesia and others is extremely high. And we have seen that the US Congress has changed in the last years its approach. They have exactly the same questions on the table as we have. Therefore, I think obviously we have to do that together, even though we won't be able to do it exactly in the same means. I have been also calling David Ciccolini from the US. There are other senators and congressmen in the US who have a very strong interest into this. I think we have to exchange our arguments. And the report of Congress is very clear that it's even stronger than what we have been finding in the European Union, at least in the public domain. So that the concern is the same, and that the solutions will also be the same. But we will have to base our solutions to the best arguments that are available. And unfortunately, the tools that we are discussing about are quite transparent. I'm always using the example with the car manufacturing. When General Motors 20 or 40 years ago was putting a company in Denver out of the market because the contract was very unfair, we discovered 10 years later that the company was already bankrupt. When Apple puts another app into the system, everyone next day understands the problem and can make a comment. So the transparency of digital markets, it's much higher than in the past. And that's positive for the global development, because we will be able to defend social market economy principles much easier. That's the first side. And now I agree also with Karina saying that we have to have future-proof solutions. That is a bit, that is clear that we all want, but the problem is how can be a law that is there to be discussed for a year, to be implemented for another year, and then to be applied, how can that be future-proof? There needs to be some flexibility. And the European Parliament, as all other parliaments in the world, for sure has a tendency not to give too many powers to the European Commission. Mr. Kramler, I'm apologizing for that. And especially in that area where you have been working hard, and we thank you for this, but we thought that you should have been working a bit faster. So this time we want to act a bit more, more fastly. Therefore, I think one element that could be used, and it's a very small focus of companies that would be opposed to it, or no, faced to it, not opposed to it, maybe also opposed to it, but most of all faced to it, is that we just change the normal procedure. We don't ask anymore the European Commission or the FTC to prove to these companies that there is a wrongdoing, but we ask the companies to prove to us that there is no wrongdoing. That for sure is a very deep change of legal principle, but it's a very flexible, protective for SMEs, respectful of the rights of the companies, but it's the easiest way to do it. We ask not anymore Google what they do, but we tell them, listen, there is a doubt, please prove us that it's wrong. And if they can prove us, I think they are fine. But with that, I think even without being bad, that the compliance structure of the companies will change from one day to another, because the compliance department will say to the boss, listen, be careful, we have to prove in the future that cannot work anymore, this cannot work anymore. It's exactly the other way around compared to what we see at the moment. Parts of this change of burden of proof is already in the Commission proposal. And like that, the European Commission gets rather a question institution than an enforcement institution. It's much easier for the Commission, with the very solid approach that they've always been choosing, to ask the right questions and to wait for the answers. And if the answers are not coming, then to hit hard and to use the stick, but to assess the wealth creation for quite a long time, rather be asking, what can we do? And I mean, the big companies had always the chance to speak to the European Commission. They haven't spoken about the right thing so far. So now it's a bit late to speak, but still we can always speak, because we have no interest in Europe, nor the Americans, neither the Australians, to destroy the wealth creation by way of digital. We want to improve it. We want to make it future-proof, and we want to make it a tool that our societies remain democratic and remain open. And every company that wants to contribute is welcome. And every scientist, every analytics, every government that wants to contribute with good ideas should be welcome. And in that process, we want to make that law. And if you can contribute to this further, I'm very happy for you to welcoming you also in the European Parliament, because that has to be the call of the economy, of the business. Let's not close the doors and stick to what you have been reading 10 years ago. Let's open your brain to make the best legislation possible in the 21st century, and that's what we try, and that's what I will guarantee you. I know that we may fail, but I will guarantee to you that we will always listen to arguments and to tools that help us to create wealth in Europe and beyond.
Thank you, MEP Swaps. Before you leave, I will ask to Philippe if you have any comment about this aid.
Yeah, just maybe a quick question. Maybe I think, Dr. Schwab, you reference this idea of kind of being in more of a consultation process with the regulators about the way in which gatekeepers comply with the regulation overall. And as you said, there's some of that instilled, I think, in the regulation. Do you see that extending further through all the articles in the DMA, or just living as it is in the Article 6 process right now?
Well, I believe that we need that stick and carrot approach in a very obvious manner, and I think we can, if we give more sticks to the European Commission or to the authorities in general, because we want to also balance that a bit with the international counterparts of the authorities. We want to then also give more flexibility to that legal tool to make markets work better. And a law is always something stable, something rigid. If there is flexibility needed, for sure, authority is much easier if they can have proofs that what they do is the right thing, instead of asking the lawmaker to give them freedom to act somehow, and the lawmaker not having control anymore about that. So I think if we change the burden of proof, the authority can be much more flexible, and like that we keep the future proof that has been asked by Karina, and we also help the big companies, because no one wants to stop digitization. No one wants to ignore the benefits in wealth, but also in intelligence and social interaction that we have thanks to this. Like that, we are united. The question is only how can we maintain that to keep democracies open and economics and businesses working on a level playing field. That's, I think, a key question of policy. And therefore, we need all input of businesses, of citizens, of authorities, of associations, and therefore this exchange has been marvelous.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanna. Please, I know you want to reply about transparency.
So I had a couple of quick thoughts. I'm in violent agreement on transparency. I think we know from economics, the more transparent the markets are, the greater efficiencies you get. So I actually think we need even more and better processes to do that. To be candid, I don't think that goes far enough. I think we need even more than transparency. To give you examples, in the disinformation case, we need to be able to clean up pollution. I mean, simply labeling a polluted lake doesn't make it potable. I actually think we need ways to clean up the information streams that we've got. I did give it a different metaphor on that. I also think that we need to do things to support democratic processes and increase the diversity of ideas. So I think those are other elements, the things I think we could try to support. Well, I was trying to get a couple of quick comments in before Dr. Schwab departed. I think there's big agreement on the transparency. One or two other comments that I would add. I think we're clearly going to have to turn to the technologists, in terms of getting this to work. So I think the software development is essential. To give you some other facts on that, we did some research that shows that firms that open APIs increase their market cap by 4%. So openness actually is a huge benefit to some of the firms. And so that's actually something that it can actually increase the economic welfare across the board. That being said, PSD2, which I'm a huge fan of, has a few challenges. I know some certain banks in Europe adhere to the letter of the law, but not the spirit, but implementing non-standard APIs, so it's really hard to access their data. So we do have to manage some of those transparency issues. I also had one or two thoughts. I also think that sharing that data is very valuable. I love the idea that Facebook is helping small and medium-sized enterprises improve their businesses. But that's not enough, actually. Suppose that third parties could also help those small and medium-sized enterprises. So maybe others could also use that data to also create benefit. Imagine Amazon or Alibaba or others could use that same data and help those small businesses be even better. This is where I would go back to some of the transparency elements and make sure that it's transparent for third parties and create legitimate markets in data that actually increase wealth. Again, going back to that original question, how do we create wealth? And then go to the question of how we divide it.
Thank you, Professor Van Allen. I'm sorry for MEP Swap. He had to leave for a meeting at 4, but we have time to continue a little bit for 5 minutes. I'm sorry we'll not be able to do a Q&A because I think this panel is very interesting. Not that the questions are not interesting for the Q&A, but let's keep in mind with the panelists. Karina, I know you want to reply to Jump a little bit.
No, just very quickly, just to add something on transparency. So here in the EU, we have already, the Commission and the national authorities also have a great transparency tool. Is the platform to business regulation, which is providing them. So I think they should make should make use of it, and also on. Especially when it comes to interoperability and how to implement access to APIs, what Professor Van Alstyne was talking about. I think here it is quite important to have a regulatory dialogue in the implementation phase. And I think here it's important to involve not only the so-called gatekeepers, but also the other market players that, like in our case, the software developers that are, that will directly benefit of this and maybe can contribute. We are talking about standards, we are talking about technical solutions. So I think their involvement is quite important. Without, I know everybody's talking about, the speed and everything should move quickly, but I think when implementing the remedies, we can, be quick, but also to have an efficient, remedy and avoid unintended consequences. I think I'm optimistic. I think we can do that, but involving everybody.
Thank you, Karina. Philippe, now you wanted to jump.
Yes, and I've got my 30-second limit, so I'll be very quick. I think we've got a lot of trade-offs to consider, an awful lot of trade-offs, and one of them is clearly, as Karina pointed out, time. There is a huge drive to get things done as quickly as possible, tomorrow, get it working tomorrow. And we've already talked about the amount of work that we needed to implement some of this legislation, so I think there is a discussion needed about how we do that in a practical manner. And this is about trade-offs at the end of the day, and making sure we don't lose some of those efficiencies that are clearly within the industry now, and we don't sort of rush to a conclusion on something with the idea of getting things done before getting them done properly. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. I will do just a short round. So I will ask to each speaker 30 seconds a final remark, final closing. I know we love these kind of things. I will start by Karina. Karina, you're on mute. Here we go.
No, so I already said it. Let's involve everybody and let's avoid unintended consequences, and let's make sure that we will have an efficient regulation and that will benefit to to growth in the EU and will not I don't know, contribute to stagnation. So
Thomas?
I think Philip hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of trade-offs to be made in such a regulatory process. There's a trade-off between the flexibility and the timeliness that MEP Schwab mentioned. There's the trade-off between how to foster innovation on the side of the gatekeepers, but also allow for innovation on the side of the business users in terms of data access. All of these trade-offs will have to be made in the mix. So this is not going to be an easy process, but the process can only be helped by an open and transparent discussion. I think that's why these kind of fora make a lot of sense, and I'd invite people to contribute as much as they can with insights to this debate. And I think we are, and MEP Schwab mentioned it. I think the legislators, the co-legislators as well, are very open to hear and learn from industry in order to make this a legislative process that works out well in the end and that provides something that makes sense for these markets. Thanks.
Professor Marshall, I know there are already a lot of literature on the DMA and on platform regulation. But a final word, if you can summarize all this literature in 30 seconds or all this debate in 30 seconds, what would you like to say?
I'll see if I can summarize it in just a few sentences. So, for the regulators, I would strongly encourage you to focus on wealth creation rather than competition creation, to focus on theories of value as much as you focus on theories of harm. For the platforms, I think it's time to be more transparent, and I think it's time to create more value than you take. I think there's so much of the value taken that's been going to the platforms themselves. I think more of it needs to go to the users and the communities in general. So I would have a couple of advice points for the regulators and for the platform. So hopefully it's balanced.
Philip, last word, if you have one.
Oh, you've had my 30 seconds there, and so I'm quite happy to wrap it up. Thanks.
So, thank you so much. I was very pleased to have you on board, and thank you, the audience. The Center for Data Innovation is very pleased to have this exchange, and obviously we'll continue this work on the DMA and on the data-related aspect of the DMA. Don't hesitate to follow your work on your website, the Center for Data Innovation.com. And thank you, and have a good afternoon. Thank you again for your acceptance for this conference, and wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thanks.